The Devil's Harvest. The silence of the condemned at the Salem witch trial. I remember the first chill of that winter as though it were yesterday, despite the many months and heartaches that followed. It was January in Salem Village, in the year of our Lord, 1692, when snow covered the ground in a pallid hush, and the wind that howled beyond our shutters warned of more than just a brutal New England cold. My name is Thomas Cooper, and I was 16 that year, with more youthful desires than wisdom. Yet what I saw and heard and felt during the trials of the so-called witches is forever seared into my memory. I did not know then how profoundly it would change my life, nor how the whispers of the devil would entangle our entire community in suspicion and terror. But I learned soon enough, God help me, what it was to live in the midst of that dreadful storm. I lived with my father, Joseph Cooper, a devout Puritan farmer, and my mother, Anne Cooper, who worked by his side, keeping our house and tending to our garden with a gentleness and firm piety that were all I had ever known. My older brother, Isaac, had already moved with his new wife to property north of the village. I missed him terribly, for he had been my companion in chores and in mischief, and without him I sometimes felt a loneliness that gnawed at me, especially in the dark of winter. There were neighbors, of course, and we knew our share of village gossip, but in Salem Village that year, the gossip turned from playful to fearsome before I even recognized the change. Our minister, Reverend Samuel Parris, was a stern man, a man of God who demanded discipline in both worship and daily life. His preaching was unlike any I had heard from the traveling ministers who sometimes passed through. Whereas others might speak of the love of Jesus, Reverend Parris's sermons were steeped in the fiery condemnation of sin and the terror of hell. He had come to Salem Village a couple of years earlier, and some welcomed his fervor, while others found him divisive. But we were taught to respect him as our spiritual shepherd, for did we not rely on him to keep our souls safe from Satan's influence? One day, word spread through the village that Reverend Parris's daughter, Betty, and his niece, Abigail Williams, were taken ill. I heard from my mother first, for she came indoors from a visit with a neighbor, her cheeks flushed. They say the girls scream in strange fits, as though bitten or pinched by unseen hands, she told my father, me standing just behind her with curiosity burning in my chest. They thrash about, crying out as if devils torment them. Dr. Griggs can find no physical cause. My father's face darkened, and a worried line creased his brow. The devil is cunning, he said. We must pray for the minister's house. But my mother seemed unsettled in a different manner, as though she sensed something more complicated at work than the devil's direct hand. That night, we prayed over a simple meal of cornmeal porridge, as we did each evening, but the prayers were longer, and father's voice trembled when he spoke. Fear lurked in the corners of our house like a black cat with reflective eyes. Soon the stories grew more alarming. I heard that Anne Putnam, Jr., a girl near my own age, and other young women in the village had started to behave the same way, barking, shrieking, speaking in odd voices, complaining of a spectre that scratched and choked them. These were not idle rumors, for the entire village soon witnessed or heard details that set tongues wagging and hearts pounding with fear. Before long, there was talk of witches. Who in the village might practice witchcraft? Who might have invited the devil into Salem? Reverend Parris, unyielding in his convictions, called upon his parishioners to root out this evil among us. The congregation whispered about malefic curses, about diabolical forces at work in the minister's own household. There was also mention of Tituba, Reverend Parris's enslaved woman from the West Indies, who had sometimes told stories of magic or spirits to children. The older folk frowned upon such stories, seeing them as a doorway to sin. Now suspicion gathered around her like a dark cloud, and I recall the hush that fell upon the meeting house one Sabbath morning when her name was uttered by some of the afflicted girls. People held their breath, uncertain, fearful, and strangely excited to see if a culprit would finally be named. It was in late February that the dam broke, and accusations were formally made. Along with Tituba, 2 other women were pointed out. Sarah Good, a beggar who wandered the village roads, and Sarah Osborne, who was bedridden most of the time and had been entangled in a dispute over inheritance. I had rarely seen Sarah Good except in passing, always with her tattered clothes and a certain bitterness in her eyes. The truth is, many in Salem Village might have guessed that if there were a witch in our midst, they might look like Sarah Good. She was a poor soul, quick-tempered and desperate, and had a face worn by hardship. When the day for the hearings came, everyone flocked to the meeting house where the examinations would take place. I was no exception, though my father had at first insisted I stay behind to watch over the livestock. I begged him to let me go, for I needed to see with my own eyes how a suspected witch might face her accusers. At last he allowed me to come, perhaps because he thought I was old enough to observe and learn the seriousness of the matter. The meeting house was crowded that day, the wooden pews creaking under the weight of anxious spectators. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and a winter's worth of musty coats. Magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin presided, their black robes giving them a sombre, almost menacing authority. The afflicted girls sat on benches near the front, some whimpering or feigning faintness whenever they dared glance at the accused. I stood in a corner, craning my neck to see. They brought in Sarah Good first. Her shoulders were hunched, and she glared at the throng as though expecting the worst. She wore threadbare clothes, and her hair hung in limp, unkempt strands. The silence in the room was oppressive until Magistrate Hathorne's voice sliced through it. "Sarah, Good," he declared. "You are accused of witchcraft, of afflicting these girls with diabolical means. What say you to this charge?" Sarah Good spat at the ground. "I do not torment them," she hissed. "I am as innocent as the babe unborn." But the afflicted girls shrieked at her denial, pointing, crying out that her spectre pinched them. Anne Putnam Jr. collapsed to the floor, writhing, crying that she saw a small black figure perched upon Sarah Good's shoulder. My heart hammered. I did not know what to believe. On the one hand, it seemed unthinkable that these young women, known to us as pious Puritan daughters, would lie in the house of God. On the other, could Sarah Good truly wield the devil's power? Sarah Osborne was carried in next. She was pale, her face drawn with illness, and she spoke in a raspy voice. She denied everything as well, but she had little strength to defend herself. The same pandemonium erupted from the afflicted girls. "She chokes me," one of them cried, clutching at her throat. "I cannot breathe when she looks at me." The magistrates pressed Sarah Osborne with questions about her dealings, about her failure to attend church regularly. She had no good answers, only the look of a frightened animal cornered by wolves. When Tituba was finally brought forward, the tension in the room grew so thick I could scarcely breathe. She was shorter than I'd imagined, with a frightened cast to her eyes, yet there was something regal about the way she held herself. She, too, was questioned sternly. To the shock of all assembled, she confessed, though we did not yet realize it was likely under great pressure from the magistrates and from Reverend Parris himself. She claimed she had seen visions of strange animals, of a tall man dressed all in black who bade her serve him. She said Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne had forced her to sign the devil's book. A ripple of horror and excitement swept through the onlookers. I recall the hush that fell over us when Tituba spoke, in a halting, trembling voice. "Yes, they come to me with the book. There were many names. Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and me." She faltered, casting her eyes around at the stern faces. "I do not wish to do it, but the devil, he is strong." She went on to describe how the devil had shown her creatures, birds with human faces, witches riding sticks, monstrous figures that tormented the girls. Every detail seemed to inflame the crowd further, feeding an appetite for the macabre that both frightened and intrigued me. It seemed inconceivable that any mortal could spin such tales if they were not touched by evil or by desperation. That night, I could not sleep. My mother and father sat by the fire, speaking in hushed tones. I hovered just out of their sight, listening. My mother said she believed the devil was indeed at work in Salem. My father said that perhaps the devil was at work, but that men could manipulate fear to settle old grudges. There was a guarded note in his voice, as though he did not fully trust what was happening in the meeting house. Still, by the next morning, everyone in the village was convinced. Witchcraft was among us, and we must root it out before it consumed our souls. The days that followed were fraught with new accusations. The names of previously respected neighbors began to tumble from the mouths of the afflicted. I overheard my mother whisper to a friend that if a beggar like Sarah Good could be arrested, then no one was safe from accusation. But among the fearful, there was also a grim excitement. Whose name would come next? If your neighbor had offended you in the past, might the afflicted girls speak out about them? The tangle of old feuds and resentments seemed to bubble to the surface. People cast sideways glances at one another, as though they expected to see the devil's mark on everyone who crossed their path. One day, my father and I were in the field by our barn, gathering wood for the fire, when we heard frantic knocking at our door. My mother answered, and an urgent voice carried across the yard. We saw Mary Warren, one of the afflicted girls who also worked as a servant in the Proctor household, standing at our threshold, tears streaming down her face. My mother gestured her inside, and we followed, uncertain. Mary was trembling, her lips parted in silent sobs. "Mary," my mother said gently, "whatever is the matter?" She collapsed into a chair. "They say I am going mad," she whispered, between shuddering breaths. "I fear I am tormented by witches. I see shapes in the night. Elizabeth Proctor. I fear her spectre torments me." I looked at my father, stunned. Elizabeth Proctor was a respected woman, though her husband, John Proctor, was known to be outspoken against the proceedings. Could Mary truly believe Elizabeth Proctor was a witch, or was she coerced? I could not keep the thought at bay. The lines between truth and falsehood were growing dangerously blurred. My father spoke quietly. "Mary, you must be certain before you make such an accusation. You know these matters are not trifling." She just shook her head, sobbing. "I am certain of nothing any more," she whimpered. "The girls say it must be Elizabeth Proctor, and now I see her spectre creeping toward me at night, threatening me with a knife." I felt an ache in my chest for Mary, who had been kind to me when we were children. She had once helped my mother with a washing chore, and I remembered her as a lively soul who giggled easily. Now she was a trembling, broken creature. My mother offered her some water and a slice of bread, and Mary clutched them as though they might keep the demons at bay. That same week, the Proctors were indeed accused. John Proctor, a stout farmer, stood up publicly and denounced the entire business as madness. But denouncing the court and the afflicted only served to draw suspicion onto himself. The afflicted pointed to him and claimed his spectre, too, tormented them. My father sighed heavily that evening, remarking, "They have turned on John because he will not cower. God have mercy." Yet for all my father's concern, he did not speak openly against the accusations. No one did, not for long. To question the proceedings was to risk being accused yourself. And so we moved about our daily tasks in a quiet dread, never knowing when someone we knew or loved would be named next. The months marched onward, and the allegations spread with a frightening swiftness, entangling more of the community. Rebecca Nurse, a beloved elderly matriarch known for her piety, was accused by the Putnams. The Putnam family harbored old grievances against the Nurse family, especially regarding land disputes. Even so, the news stunned everyone. How could such a God-fearing woman as Rebecca Nurse be a witch? But Ann Putnam Jr. and the other afflicted swore it was so, crying out in the meeting house that her spectre choked them in the night. I stood there the day Rebecca Nurse was taken into custody, her kind face drawn in confusion and sorrow. She did not rage or protest loudly. She only asked for God's guidance. Some in the crowd stood aghast. A few even wept openly, but the machine of accusation did not slow. Once set in motion, it devoured any who stood in its path. And there were many who remembered slights, resentments, or land disputes that could now find resolution in the simplest way: an accusation of witchcraft. As spring melted into early summer, the jails overflowed with the accused. The strain on the community deepened. To pay for their own upkeep in jail, families had to mortgage property or sell livestock. The tension and fear were so thick that even children like me felt the chill in every silent glance exchanged in the meeting house, in every frantic conversation at the well. I began to dread each new dawn, wondering whose name would next be whispered on the breeze. In May, a special court called Oyer and Terminer was established in Salem town, presided over by men such as Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton. Governor Phipps had arrived in the colony and commissioned this court to handle the rising tide of witchcraft cases. The trials were to be more formal now, though, as I quickly learned, the formalities brought no mercy for the accused. I recall the first execution clearly. It was Bridget Bishop, a woman known for her tavern and for wearing a red bodice, which many considered scandalous. On June 10th, 1692, she was taken to the gallows at a place we would come to call Proctor's Ledge, though sometimes it was referred to as Gallows Hill. I did not want to go, but a part of me felt compelled to witness it, for so many others from the village planned to do so. My father forbade me at first, saying it was no place for a boy, but I insisted that I was old enough to understand. How I wish I had stayed away. The gallows stood in stark silhouette against the pale sky. A crowd gathered, some wearing expressions of grim resignation, others with a disturbing hunger to see the devil's agent meet her end. Bridget Bishop was led out, her hands bound, her face contorted in fear. Reverend Nicholas Noyes stood by, offering her a chance to confess before God. When she refused, stating again and again her innocence, they placed the noose around her neck. My stomach lurched, and I trembled so fiercely I could hardly remain standing. When the cart beneath her was pulled away, the sound of her body dropping and the sudden tightening of the rope tore through me like a nightmare made real. It was the first time I had seen someone die. I remember turning away and retching into the dirt, tears burning my eyes. The crowd was silent except for a few who sobbed, and for those afflicted girls who trembled as though the devil himself had just lost one of his disciples. The hush that fell after her body was cut down was a new brand of horror, a foreboding that told us this was only the beginning. In the days that followed, more and more people were indicted. Sarah Good, who had been languishing in jail, gave birth there. Her infant did not survive long. Soon after, Sarah Good was hanged as well. Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Wilds, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe. The list grew. By late July, 5 more souls had been executed. The same pattern followed. The afflicted testified of spectres. The court listened. Spectral evidence, the claim that the accused spirit appeared to torment the accusers, was weighed heavily. If the accused refused to confess, the noose awaited them. If they confessed, naming others, they might be spared for a time. It was a perversion of justice that made me ill, and it haunted our entire village. I tried to talk to my father about it one evening, as we milked our cow in the barn. It was humid, and the scent of hay and animal sweat mingled with the bitterness in my chest. "Father," I said quietly, "how can we know the truth? So many have died, but if they are truly innocent, then what if we have murdered them wrongly?" He looked at me sadly, pausing in his chore. "Thomas, I have asked myself the same question." He set down the milk pail and looked at the dusty barn floor. "But to speak too loudly in defense of the accused is dangerous. The devil works in cunning ways. Who are we to question God's will or the court's wisdom?" He said the words, but the torn expression on his face revealed his uncertainty. The truth was that no one knew how to stop it. The afflicted girls held terrifying power. A mere pointing of a finger could ruin a life, and the judges seemed determined to rid the land of witchcraft, no matter how many must hang. Each night, as I lay in bed, I prayed for God's mercy, prayed that no more innocents would die. I prayed that I would never see my father or mother or brother's name on an arrest warrant. And I prayed that the afflicted girls would be cured of whatever tormented them, if indeed it was an affliction at all. In August, the net of suspicion widened further. John Proctor and Elizabeth Proctor were tried. John Proctor, with defiance in his eyes, pleaded for common sense. demanded that the spectral evidence be disregarded. But the court pressed forward. In a swirl of confusion and pointed fingers, John Proctor was declared guilty of witchcraft. Elizabeth, who was pregnant, received a stay of execution until she gave birth, but her fate was left in limbo. I watched John Proctor mount the gallows, his head held high, refusing to confess a lie. I saw him join those others who went to their deaths proclaiming innocence. The crowd was unsettled. More than a few cried that John Proctor was wrongly condemned, but still the hangings continued. Reverend Parris, who had initiated much of the alarm with the troubles in his household, continued to preach about the devil's infiltration in Salem. Some believed wholeheartedly in his warnings, their fear overshadowing any qualms. Others grew uneasy, recognizing that good people, neighbors, friends, were dying. But the logic of fear had taken root, spreading like a poisonous vine. Among those who had first supported the trials, a handful began to express doubts. I heard murmurs from grown men that these confessions might be coerced, or that the afflicted girls may not be entirely trustworthy. Yet these doubts were whispered only in secret. In the open, the same frenzied crusade continued. I found myself straddling the line between fear and fury. I was frightened of the accusations, frightened for my family, but also furious that our village had turned into a place of suspicion, betrayal, and death. Each day I awakened feeling weighed down, as though an invisible hand pressed upon my heart. I recall one muggy afternoon in late August, after church service, when I saw Giles Corey standing near the meeting house, his weathered face grim. Giles was a farmer in his early 80s, tough as an old oak. He had been accused himself, but refused to stand trial. His wife, Martha, had been arrested and was awaiting her own trial. Giles believed these trials were monstrous, and he made no secret of that. I heard him curse the proceedings under his breath as he stared at the meeting house door. I felt a surge of admiration for his courage, tempered by the knowledge that open defiance of the court was dangerous. By September, the madness reached a peak. Giles Corey was pressed to death under heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea. I did not see this brutal event, for they carried it out in an open field away from the town, but I heard the grim details from those who did. Each time they laid on more weight, hoping to force him to plead guilty or innocent, he only cried, "More weight." He died beneath that crushing burden, never giving the court the satisfaction of a confession or a denial. It was a horrifying testament to the cruelty that had taken hold. With each passing execution, 19 souls, hang by the neck, plus Giles Corey pressed, my spirit seemed to erode. The first time I witnessed a hanging, I was sick with horror. By the 10th or 11th, I felt a numbness that shamed me. How could such brutality become commonplace? Yet this was our daily reality now, a bitter poison in the well of our community. And then, the improbable happened. By October, some of the more prominent men of the colony, Increase Mather among them, began to speak against the reliance on spectral evidence. The outcry grew that the proceedings were unjust. Doubt seeped into the halls of the court. Perhaps it had been the execution of so many who were widely believed to be pious and good. Perhaps it was the resignation of others who, seeing the unstoppable tide, had tried to distance themselves. Or perhaps Governor Phipps, who had stayed largely silent, finally recognized that a line had been crossed. The special court of Oyer and Terminer was dissolved, and a new superior court of judicature took its place, one that was more skeptical of the afflicted girl's claims. In January of the new year, 1693, this new court freed many of the remaining prisoners. For some, the damage was already done. They had lost everything. For others, it was a miraculous reprieve. Elizabeth Proctor, who had given birth in jail, was eventually released. I remember seeing her in the village once more, hollow-eyed, struggling to find her way in the aftermath. She had lost her husband to the gallows, and the stigma of witchcraft had not entirely disappeared. It was an uneasy peace that settled on Salem Village. People were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Families who had been torn apart by accusations eyed one another warily. Some of the afflicted girls apologized in later years, explaining that they had been mistaken or led astray. Others maintained that what they had experienced had been real. Reverend Paris faced growing opposition, and eventually he too would leave Salem Village under the weight of resentment. As for me, I was left with a profound sorrow that was difficult to shake. I had come of age in a climate of terror and confusion, witnessing my neighbors turned against one another in a frenzy. I never forgot the sight of Bridget Bishop on the gallows, nor the stories of Giles Corey's death under the pressing stones. In the years after, whenever I walked by the old jail or crossed paths with survivors of the ordeal, I was reminded anew of how fragile our sense of righteousness and justice can be when infected by fear. I still recall the day in 1693 when winter had come again, though not as harsh as the year before. I walked to the fields with my father, cutting across a patch of ground that had once belonged to a woman accused of witchcraft, her property seized and auctioned off after her hanging. A flock of crows took flight, scattering across a grey sky. My father paused, leaning on his walking stick, and looked at me with a heaviness in his gaze. "Thomas," he said softly, "you have seen much in your short years. I pray that God will grant you the wisdom and compassion to remember it well. We must learn from this, else we are lost to our sins." I nodded, unable to speak for the lump in my throat. In the distance, I could see the shape of the meeting-house spire. For months, that place had echoed with accusations and cries of torment, and now there was a dreadful silence in its wake, a silence that spoke of shame and regret. I wanted to believe that such things would never happen again, that we would not allow fear to twist our hearts to the point of murder. But I knew better now. Human weakness is always waiting beneath the surface, waiting for the right spark of panic or prejudice to blaze anew. All I could do was hold tight to the memory of these dark times, hoping that a better day might dawn, that future generations might heed the lessons of our tragedy. In the years that followed, people wrote about the Salem witch trials, trying to make sense of it all. Surviving families petitioned the government to clear the names of those who had been executed as witches. Some restitution was granted, though no sum of money could ever restore the lives stolen by panic and superstition. The afflicted girls grew up, married, moved on, though I cannot say what regrets they carried in their hearts. I suspect they bore a heavy burden of guilt, regardless of whether they admitted it. Over time, I found work as a carpenter, building and mending houses in Salem Village. I moved with my parents to a new plot of land where we tried to leave behind the ghosts of the past. But how does one bury such a memory? How does one forget the unimaginable? It stayed with us, quietly shaping every conversation and every glance. Even the land itself seemed stained with sorrow. One late summer day, a full year after the final trials, I found myself in the orchard behind our new house. The trees were heavy with apples, the air scented with the sweetness of ripe fruit. I was picking apples to bring inside, and my mother stood nearby, her apron lifting in the breeze. A sudden gust shook the branches, and a shower of leaves fell around us. For a moment, I felt a deep and startling peace, as though nature were reminding me that life endures, that there is renewal even after the harshest winter. Mother looked at me, a small, sad smile lighting her face. "God's mercies are new every morning," she said, quoting scripture softly. I nodded, but a tear escaped my eye. My thoughts drifted to the faces of those who would never see another morning. I prayed that wherever their souls had gone, they might find the peace denied to them in this world. In the decades that followed, the village slowly healed, though the scars remained. Some lines of neighborly trust were never fully repaired. Some families carried the shame of ancestors who had pointed fingers or served as accusers. Others carried the pride and the heartbreak of those who died proclaiming innocence. The name of Salem became forever entwined with witchcraft, a cautionary tale about the perils of mass hysteria and the tragic consequences when justice is overshadowed by fear. I have often been asked, by younger folk who did not experience it, how such a thing could have happened. They expect a simple explanation, but there is none. It was a perfect storm of fear. Fear of the devil, fear of Indian attacks on the frontier, fear of God's wrath, fear of each other. That fear was ignited by personal grudges, by a faltering economy, by stern religious fervor that left little room for doubt or mercy. Once the flames were lit, they raged uncontrolled, devouring the innocent. And yet I do not blame only the afflicted girls, or the judges, or the ministers. We all played a part, in our silence or our complicity. We allowed the blind panic to grow, allowed hearsay and rumor to carry the same weight as truth. We traded compassion for suspicion and reason for superstition. We let ourselves become instruments of cruelty, convinced that we were doing God's work. In truth, we were our own devil. Even now, many years later, when the orchard has matured and I have children of my own, I cannot walk by the old gallows site without pausing. The ground there is unremarkable, just another patch of earth. One would never guess how many tears were shed there, how many desperate prayers were offered. But I feel it in the air, a reminder that a community once lost its soul in that place. I remember the last time I visited that site deliberately, on the anniversary of the final hangings. I was older, my hair touched with grey. A gentle drizzle fell, soaking the grass, and thunder rumbled in the distance. I stood there alone, praying silently for the souls lost to the madness. I prayed for forgiveness for all of us, for those who had sinned in accusing and those who had sinned in silence. Lightning flickered across the sky, illuminating the stark hill for a moment, and then it was dark again. I bowed my head, tears mingling with the rain on my cheeks. I asked God for the strength to carry the memory without bitterness. Salem Village tried to move on. Over time, its name would change to Danvers to distance itself from the horrors of 1692. But the story of the trials would never be forgotten. Travellers passing through would speak in hushed tones of witches and devils, of dancing in the woods. Some embroidered the tale with more terror than truth. Others sought to learn from it. But the heartbeat of the story, the raw human tragedy, remained. A handful of humble memorials eventually marked the memory of the condemned, engraved with their names and final words. It was too late for them, but perhaps not too late for humanity to remember and understand. That is what I do now, in the quiet of my evenings, as I rock by the hearth in my old age. I remember. I can still see the bleak winter fields, still feel the ominous hush when the afflicted girls began their accusations, still taste the bile in my throat on the day Bridget Bishop was hanged. I also remember the men and women who kept their dignity in the face of terror. Rebecca Nurse kneeling in prayer, John Proctor refusing to trade his name for a lie, Giles Corey whispering, "More weight," unbroken in spirit. They remain with me, guiding my conscience and reminding me that courage often blooms in the darkest hour. I also recall kind gestures that persisted even amid the panic. A neighbor who slipped bread through the bars for an accused woman. A farmer who secretly raised bail money for a friend. A wife who, despite her own terror, dared to speak a word of doubt in the presence of authority. These moments of compassion shine like tiny candles in the overwhelming dark. They tell me that even when fear reigns, goodness does not vanish entirely. To the younger generation, or to any who might read these words long after I am gone, I say, beware of the poisons that can infect a community when fear overrides reason and love. Beware of righteous anger that blinds you to truth. Beware of any cause that demands bloodshed in the name of virtue. For the devil is not always a horned beast lurking in the forest. Sometimes the devil is the hatred we cultivate within ourselves, the thirst for vengeance, the refusal to see our neighbor's humanity. I speak now from the vantage of many years. I have lived long enough to see happiness and sorrow, births and deaths, war and peace. Yet none of my experiences so thoroughly shaped my soul as the events of 1692 in Salem Village. I was but a boy, and yet I witnessed an evil that men wrought upon men. Today I am an old man, and I can offer only this testimony, that the trials taught us what destruction we can bring upon ourselves when fear and suspicion hold sway. Even the most pious can become the most cruel under the right conditions. We used to think ourselves the chosen people of God, building his city on a hill. Perhaps we still are, in some sense. But even the chosen must guard against pride and paranoia, must temper zeal with mercy. Our tragedy might serve as a stark reminder that in persecuting others, we risk condemning ourselves. My pen trembles as I commit these final recollections to paper, though my heart is resolute. This is my account, as best as I can remember, of those dreadful months when Salem Village lost its way. I have tried to keep it true. Some details are burned into my mind, others may have blurred over time. But the essence remains. The desperation in people's eyes, the unstoppable tide of accusations, the sorrow of each execution, and the slow, painful dawn of realization that we had gone terribly astray. I cannot say what forgiveness might look like for Salem Village, or for those who played their parts on either side of the accusations. Perhaps only God can render that judgment. But I do believe in redemption. I believe we can choose to learn, to repent of our blindness, and to vow never again to let such a horror befall our community. That, at least, is my prayer. If anyone in the future should doubt that such a nightmare occurred, they need only walk the roads of Salem, look upon the old foundations of houses that once sheltered both the accused and the accusers, and read the records of the trials. They will find that we condemned our own neighbors to death on the flimsiest of evidence, that we believed in specters and the illusions of fear, that we allowed vendettas to masquerade as piety. And they will also find the quiet, unwavering witness of those who refused to submit their consciences, those who died for truth. That contrast, that conflict of souls, is the enduring human story within the Salem witch trials. The orchard behind our house still blossoms each spring, and in the autumn we gather the apples in barrels. My father is long gone now, claimed by illness some years after the trials, but I still feel his presence there, urging me to remember. At times I see the ghost of my younger self standing under the branches, full of confusion and fear. I want to tell that boy it will someday be all right, that the mania will pass and justice will prevail. Yet I know it is not so simple. The mania passes, yes, but the scars remain. The sorrow endures alongside hope. That is the nature of life and the lesson of Salem. So I continue. I carry on the work of everyday life, harnessing the horse, tending the fields, building a new shed when one rots away, raising children, teaching them to read and to pray. And in my lessons to them, I do not shy away from the truth of what happened. I teach them that witches, in the sense we accused them, may not have been real, but the capacity for darkness resides in each of us. I tell them that the true sin was not in conjuring devils, but in failing to see Christ in our neighbor. Yes, there are times I still wake in the night, a cold sweat on my brow, recalling the echo of a rope snapping taut, or the gavel pounding in the courthouse, or the shrieks of the afflicted. The nightmares linger, but I no longer run from them. They are part of who I am and part of our village's past. Sometimes, facing the dark is the only way to grasp the light. When the warmer seasons return each year, I lay a small wreath of wildflowers at the foot of Proctor's ledge. No ceremony, no audience, just me kneeling quietly, placing the flowers on the ground. It is my tribute to those who died, a silent apology that I did not speak out as a boy. Others have come to do the same over time, leaving tokens of remembrance. One can see them scattered among the grass, a handful of daisies, a wooden cross, a note scrawled with words of contrition. We gather there, sometimes strangers, sometimes neighbors, bound by a mutual awareness of that painful history. We share a moment of reflection, acknowledging the past. And in those shared moments, I find a measure of solace. We cannot change what was done, but we can remember, we can mourn, and we can seek to live differently, with humility and empathy. If there is one final truth I have gleaned from those harrowing days, it is that evil often wears the mask of virtue. The men and women who hunted witches believed they served God and community. The judges believed they were guardians of moral order. The afflicted girls may have believed they were testifying truth, and yet the result was the slaughter of innocents. We must therefore question ourselves, always, and temper our righteousness with compassion, our justice with mercy, our certainty with doubt. Only then may we steer clear of the pit into which Salem Village once fell. I conclude this account with a humble prayer that you, dear reader, whoever you are, in whatever time or place you find yourself, will take these words to heart. I was but one witness among many. My name, Thomas Cooper, is insignificant compared to the weight of the events themselves, but I offer my story so that those who come after me will not repeat our mistakes. Learn from Salem's sorrow. Remember that fear can corrode even the strongest moral foundations, and that truth must forever be our guiding star. I set down my quill now, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls of my home. It is a modest dwelling, filled with the scent of cooking stew and the laughter of grandchildren in another room. Life goes on. We remain. May the memory of the Salem witch trials forever remind us of the darkness that can befall a community, and of the love and reason we must guard in our hearts, lest we become devils to one another. I cannot sleep now, though the hour grows late. The night wind rattles against the shutters, and the fire is almost spent. Still, my mind wanders through all the corners of my memory, as though I am compelled to sift every grain of truth from the sands of recollection. There are small details, seemingly insignificant, that flood back to me at odd moments. The timbre of a neighbor's voice when they spoke in hushed secrecy about their suspicions, the scratch of a quill on parchment as an arrest warrant was scribbled by candlelight, the faint odor of mildew in the jail where the accused were crowded together. Each detail weaves into the tapestry of that grim year, and I find myself desperate to preserve it all, as if by doing so I can offer testimony on behalf of the silenced dead. I recall the tension between Salem Village and Salem Town, how those living in the village felt overshadowed by the wealthier merchants in the town. The line between the two communities was more than just geographical. It was a matter of pride and suspicion. Village folk felt the town dwellers were too worldly, too concerned with commerce and money-making. Meanwhile, town folk might look down upon the villagers as backward or overly zealous. In the swirl of accusations, these resentments simmered, forging alliances and enmities that shaped the course of events. Some of the accused, like Bridget Bishop, lived closer to the town and kept taverns. Others, like the Nurse family, were respected landowners in the village. The friction between these spheres, combined with the personal vendettas carried by prominent families like the Putnams and the Porters, created a minefield of suspicion that needed only a spark. That spark came in the form of the afflicted girls, and the entire region erupted in flames. I remember noting how they behaved in unison, feeding off each other's fear and drama. At first, villagers believed them wholeheartedly, for who would doubt that a child of a Puritan household might lie about such a grave matter? But as the weeks wore on and more names were cast about, some tried to question their veracity. Yet the moment someone doubted them openly, that person would become a target. Self-preservation demanded silence or compliance. The girls' power grew. I remember, too, how the role of local ministers shaped our downfall. Reverend Parris in the village and other influential clergymen in the region often preached about the imminent threat of the devil. They referred to the colony's precarious situation, attacks by French and native forces on the frontiers, epidemics, and harsh winters. All of these were interpreted as signs of God's judgment. If we were not vigilant, the devil would surely exploit our weaknesses. When the girls started exhibiting their fits, it seemed a direct confirmation of these warnings. The community was primed to see the devil's handiwork in every unexplained event, every misfortune. Ministers like Increase and Cotton Mather published treatises on witchcraft, describing how cunning and deceptive the devil could be. This gave theological backing to the legal actions that followed. In the eyes of the court, to doubt the possibility of witchcraft was to doubt the very words of Scripture and the learned clergy. And then there was the matter of the court of Oyer and Terminer itself. Governor Phipps, newly arrived, entrusted men like William Stoughton with a task that demanded prudence and a keen sense of justice. Instead, we found a court predisposed to accept spectral evidence, a concept that had never been the norm in English law. The afflicted girl's claims of seeing spectres, ghostly manifestations of the accused, were treated as legitimate proof, despite the inherent impossibility of the accused defending themselves against such intangible testimony. Some in the colony quietly questioned whether English legal standards were being subverted, but their voices were drowned out by the rising tide of fear. Amidst this maelstrom, I remember yearning for a simpler time. Though I was only a youth, I had treasured the relative peace of our fields, the steady rhythm of chores and seasons. I had delighted in winter nights by the hearth, listening to my father read from Scripture or recite tales of our forefathers. I had dreamed of adulthood as a time of freedom, perhaps even travel. But all those gentle dreams were overshadowed by the stark realities of the witch hunt. The world was not gentle at all. It was harsh, abrupt, and governed by forces of suspicion I could barely fathom. One memory refuses to leave my mind: an encounter with a neighbor, Francis Nurse, husband to Rebecca Nurse. He was older, with kind but weary eyes. This was shortly after Rebecca's arrest. He came to our house, hat in hand, asking my father to speak on her behalf. "You know my wife," he said, voice trembling. "You know her piety, her goodness. Tell them she is no witch." My father stood there, torn. He admired Rebecca Nurse and believed her innocent, but to sign a petition or speak openly might endanger our own family. In the end, father offered only tepid support, something along the lines of, "I believe she is a good Christian woman." He did not attend the hearings to speak for her in person. Fear held him back. Francis Nurse left with a look in his eyes that I can only describe as heartbreak and betrayal, though he tried to hide it behind a stoic nod. I have never forgiven myself, or my father, for our silence that day. Rebecca Nurse went to the gallows not long afterward. Sociologically, it was a perfect storm. Tensions about property lines, church membership disputes, personal grudges, and religious paranoia all fed into the accusations. If one family held a long-standing quarrel with another, or if a young woman had once been chastised by an older neighbor for some small offense, that memory could blossom into an accusation of witchcraft. People found that old bitterness could be cloaked in moral righteousness by claiming diabolical attack. And once accused, you were almost powerless to prove your innocence. The court expected confessions or the naming of other witches to confirm guilt. The whole system was built in such a way that the truth was easily lost, drowned in a cacophony of hysterical testimony. We cannot ignore the role that sexism and social status played. Many of the accused were women, some older, beyond childbearing years, less protected by family alliances. Others were outspoken or had reputations for not conforming to the expected submissive role. Sarah Good was poor and abrasive. Sarah Osborne had remarried and was embroiled in inheritance disputes. Bridget Bishop owned a tavern and wore colourful clothing. Rebecca Nurse was the anomaly in that she was widely respected, yet that respect crumbled beneath the weight of accusation. The devil, people whispered, could disguise himself in the form of the most pious. This warped logic meant that no one was safe. Men were also accused, particularly those who openly questioned the girls. John Proctor was among the first male victims, and he was an outspoken critic. Giles Corey, likewise, refused to play by the court's rules. They paid dearly. One aspect that stands out in my recollection is the courtroom drama itself. The moment an accused person protested their innocence, the afflicted would cry out, contort, and demonstrate their supposed torments. It was theatre in the worst sense. The entire courtroom riveted, the judges pressed to interpret these visible fits as a sign of invisible crime. If the accused glared or sighed, the girls would claim to feel stabbing pains. If the accused dared show anger, it only confirmed the notion that the devil was within them. To remain calm, however, was taken as cunning. There was no safe demeanor or argument. Everything could be twisted to confirm guilt. That is part of why the entire enterprise felt so hopeless to me. The logic of the court was circular, impervious to evidence or reason. I will never forget how swiftly each hearing moved, from accusation to conviction to the gallows. There was often little time for the accused to mount any real defense. The spectral evidence overshadowed all else. and confessions, whether genuine or forced, fueled further accusations. By the time the hysteria began to subside, entire families had been uprooted, reputations ruined, and children left orphaned. The economic damage to the village was extensive. Crops went unharvested while heads of households languished in jail. Livestock was sold for a fraction of their worth to pay for jail fees. Property changed hands abruptly. The ripple effect of ruin was astonishing. As the trials ended and people were released, the village was left in moral disarray. Apologies began surfacing, but some came only under duress or to mitigate public scorn. One of the most notable statements came from Judge Samuel Sewell, who stood in church one day, bowing his head in penance for his role in the trials. That public act of contrition resonated deeply, though it could not bring back the dead. Others, like Stoughton, never fully expressed remorse, convinced they had done God's work. The deep rift among our leaders and citizens remained open for many years. There was also the matter of restitution. Some families petitioned the government, asking for compensation for wrongful execution and imprisonment. After years of legal wrangling, the government offered small sums, but it was more symbolic than truly reparative. How could a few coins ever heal the memory of a mother or father hanged before your eyes? How could it absolve the communal guilt that clung to us like a persistent shadow? At times, I wonder about the afflicted girls as they grew into adulthood. Did they look back with regret? Some did offer public apologies, claiming they had been deceived by Satan. Others quietly moved away from Salem to escape the stigma. Their names remain in the records, forever linked to the tragedy. I try to see them not simply as villains, but as children caught up in a frenzy that spiraled far beyond their understanding. Yet the suffering they wrought was real. It is a bitter lesson in how easily a group's shared delusion or fear can manifest as atrocity. The passing of time dulled the immediate terror, but it did not erase the memory. In the ensuing decades, as the colony developed and merged with others, as wars raged beyond our borders, the Salem witch trials receded into history, but never fully faded. The generation that followed mine heard the stories in hushed whispers, gleaning cautionary tales about what happens when justice is blinded by superstition. Some older folk tried to bury the story out of shame, while younger folk found themselves morbidly fascinated by the question, how could ordinary Christians become agents of such cruelty? For many years I asked myself the same question, trying to dissect our moral collapse. Perhaps the simplest explanation is that we were afraid of the unknown, of eternal damnation, of failing God, of one another. Fear can unify a community, but it can also tear it apart. Combined with dogmatic certainty and a potent sense of righteousness, that fear becomes lethal. In 1692, it happened in Salem Village, but I suspect it could happen anywhere under the right circumstances. As the new century approached, I saw signs of transformation in the Massachusetts Bay colony. The rigid Puritan orthodoxy began to shift, influenced by Enlightenment ideas filtering across the Atlantic. People started to question old doctrines, to favor reason and tolerance over blind zeal. Harvard College expanded its curriculum, encouraging broader thinking among ministers. The Great Awakening would come in a few decades, further changing the religious landscape. By the time I was an old man, the colony was no longer the strict bastion of uniform Puritan beliefs it had been in my youth. This change did not erase our tragic past, but it offered hope that we might avoid repeating the same catastrophe. Yet my heart remained heavy with the knowledge that no matter how society evolves, the seeds of hysteria and scapegoating are always present. Humans have an uncanny ability to divide themselves into the righteous and the damned, to seek simple explanations for complex problems. Whenever the storms of hardship roll in, be it war, famine, or plague, the temptation to blame a sinister other can resurface. I have sometimes asked traveling merchants if they have heard of similar panics elsewhere, and they speak of regions where witchcraft trials still occur, though never again on the same scale as ours. The lesson is there for all to see. Zealotry and fear rarely lead to justice. As I write, I sense my energy waning. My joints ache, and the candlelight flickers, casting dancing shadows on the parchment. But I push forward, determined to leave nothing unspoken, no stone unturned. I return to certain figures in my mind, as though revisiting old friends or enemies. I remember the stoic dignity of those who refused to lie to save themselves. John Proctor, Rebecca Nurse, Martha Corey, Mary Esty, and so many others. I remember the cunning glances exchanged by those who may have exploited the hysteria for personal gain, naming enemies or those from whom they coveted land. I remember the heartbreak on the faces of children torn from their jailed mothers, unsure if they would ever see them again. One memory above all leaves me with a sliver of hope, the fact that eventually, even amid the mania, some form of reason reasserted itself. Governor Phipps intervened, the court was dissolved, and people began to voice their doubts openly. The condemnation of spectral evidence was a turning point, as was the push by men like Increase Mather to restore more traditional legal standards. It took too long, cost too many lives, but the mania did not reign forever. People finally asked, "What if we are wrong?" That question, that simple doubt, was the key to halting the tragedy. It is a question we should never fear to ask. I remember hearing of an encounter after the trials had ended, when one of the afflicted girls crossed paths with a woman who had been jailed but ultimately released. They locked eyes on the dusty road near the meeting house. The girl, now older, tried to speak, to offer a word of explanation or apology. The woman bowed her head and said nothing, continuing on her way. The gravity of that unspoken moment still strikes me. How could any apology suffice? The wounds were too deep, the trust too thoroughly shattered. I imagine that girl lived with her guilt for the rest of her life, and that woman bore the scars of betrayal for just as long. In that silent intersection of two souls lies the entire tragedy of Salem. It is late now, and I hear the soft breathing of my wife in the adjoining room, the gentle slumber of someone who never knew the horrors of 1692 firsthand, but who has listened patiently to my stories over the years. Her warmth has carried me through many dark nights. I think of the children asleep under our roof, and of the many more children in Salem Village who never had a chance to grow up with their parents because fear and suspicion took them away. I sigh, feeling both gratitude and sorrow. Life has blessed me, yet it cursed me with the memory of that darkness. Perhaps in sharing these recollections, writing them in such detail, I can find a measure of peace. Perhaps someone, some day, will read these words and feel empathy stir in their breast. Perhaps they will realize that the real lesson of Salem is not about witches or the devil, but about the fragile lines that hold a community together, and how quickly they can be severed by suspicion. They say that time heals all wounds, but I know some wounds linger beneath the surface, half-healed at best. Even now, decades after the final hanging, some families in Salem Village do not speak to one another. The memories of those accusations remain, if not in the minds of the living, then in the stories passed down. Children grow up hearing that their grandmother was hanged as a witch, or that their grandfather sat on the jury that condemned her. These histories shape identities. Reconciliation is possible, I believe, but it requires humility and a willingness to see beyond old grudges. Before I blow out the candle, I remember one last scene that seems a fitting close to my tale. It was a day in early spring, many years after the trials. The snow had just melted, and small green buds were visible on the branches. A group of us gathered at the meeting house to discuss some routine village matter, repairs to the roof, if I recall. In the midst of our conversation, one of the older men stood up and said, "Brethren, let us offer a prayer." We expected a typical Puritan prayer, but instead he lifted his face to the rafters and spoke words that stunned us all. "Lord, forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. We have all sinned, and we ask thee for mercy and unity." He paused then, his voice cracking. "Let us rebuild not just this meeting house, but our trust in one another." A hush fell. No one spoke for several heartbeats. Then, slowly, we bowed our heads, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something shift in the air, a collective exhalation of sorrow, a faint glimmer of hope. That is perhaps the real end of the Salem witch trials. The moment we admitted our brokenness, reached out for forgiveness, and tried, however imperfectly, to find our way back to each other. I now lay down my quill, trusting that these many words, my recollections, my confessions, my warnings, will serve their purpose. They are the testimony of an ordinary villager who witnessed extraordinary cruelty. Let them stand as a reminder of how easily we can lose our way and how desperately we need compassion and reason to guide us. If you who read this take away but one lesson, let it be this: love your neighbor, even in the face of fear, for fear is fleeting, but love is eternal. And may the mistakes of Salem forever guide us toward a gentler, wiser future.